Hi there. One of the most common questions I've received on my Tyranid tutorials has been how I would translate the coconut crab scheme to Genestealer cults. I hadn't actually done this myself, so rather than just give a step-by-step tutorial on the paint scheme, I figured I'd talk through the process of creating it. When I develop a color scheme, I tend to think in terms of material. Looking at the Genestealer cults miniatures, I see a couple of major materials: skin, armor plating, armor ribbing, mining uniform, leather slings, straps, pouches, and boots, and cult colors. Many models have a skirt, tabard, or other detail in a repeated color, which I interpret to be insignia for the cult. So, since my intent is to translate the coconut crab scheme to these models, I think the cult color is a good place to start. The palette on my Tyranids is deliberately limited, so I really have bone, orange, and dark brown to pick from. Of these, I think the orange will be the most distinctive, so I'll assign that to the cult colors. Next, the mining uniform. This is indicative of the cult's origins among the human population, so I want it to contrast with the cult colors. Since the basing of the Tyranid army implies an aquatic theme, a blue seems appropriate here, so I'll go with the same blue-gray I use on my stormtroopers. For the leather, I have a recipe for brown leather that I quite like, so I'll use that. This also helps me get some dark brown tones onto the model, which will help tie it back to the Tyranids. That leaves the armor plating and ribbing. To avoid making the model too colorful, I think I'll keep these in grayscale, with a dark gray for the ribbing and medium gray for the plating. Lastly, for the skin, I considered painting it in the bone color of the Tyranids, but I felt that might be a bit too on the nose. After all, this cult is supposed to blend in with the human population, so I think I'll keep it in human flesh tones for now. In general, I'm going to stick to the technique I used on the stormtroopers: base coat, 2 highlights of each color, and then a wash at the end to shade and tie it together. Okay, so now I'll actually prime in Neophyte. Ignore the color on the knee pad, that was an unrelated experiment. To start, I use Viejo model color beige red to base coat the skin. Then I use blue-gray for the uniform, dark gray for the armor ribbing and autogun, and orange-brown for the skirt. You'll notice I'm starting with colors that are physically separated from one another for the most part, so I can quickly work while previous colors are still wet, and without having to worry too much about avoiding spillover onto adjacent areas. I go back and do a second layer on each color to even out the coverage. Next is German Camo medium brown for all the leather, now being careful to avoid getting paint on areas I've already painted. After painting it in, it's clear that this model has a lot of leather. I think that brown will work nicely to tie back to the Tyranid scheme. Now I get out neutral gray. Normally I want to base coat all my colors before doing any highlighting, but I think the armor ribbing will look best with a bit of dry brushing, so I do that messy technique now before the rest of the model is fully painted. This adds some nice definition to the ribs without taking the time to individually highlight every one. With the same neutral gray, I now block in the armor plating. Then, paint the raised borders on the ribbing. Since I already have the neutral gray out, I'll go ahead and use it to highlight the raised edges of the autogun. The sharp edges of the rifle's receiver and magazine well are easy to edge highlight with the side of my brush. Alright, so the autogun is highlighted and the armor is blocked in, but now I'm second guessing myself. There just isn't a lot of contrast between the ribbing and armor plates, so I think I'd like to try pushing the armor plates a bit brighter. So I use light gray and just rebase the armor plating. It would have been easier to apply this over the white, but hey, this is part of experimentation. And there we go, much more contrast now. And since I have the light gray out, I'll go ahead and do the final level of highlights on the autogun, just picking out the most prominent upward facing edges. The autogun is done at this point and the armor is all base coated, so now I'll do some of the minor accent colors. I use hull red to block in what appears to be dynamite. I chose a dark red for this to keep it subtle, because I don't want a lot of bright accent colors distracting from the core scheme. Now I use black and carefully pick out the strap on the goggles. Then green-gray for the casing of the single fragmentation grenade. And lastly, German camo beige for the fuse and binding on the dynamite cluster. At this point, everything except the metallics is now blocked in. You may notice I painted in the hoses on the armor, having realized that they should be a different material from the rest of the armor. Often I'll notice these details as I go. It's hard to tell what element should be what color just from the bare plastic or primer. Anyways, next is an equal parts mix of Viejo metal color steel and silver, and I'll use it to base coat the metallics. I highly recommend the Viejo metal color line for silver metallics, it's really good stuff. Alright, no more white on this model, so now I can get into highlighting. I'll start with the skin, and use an equal parts mix of beige red and light flesh to pick out all the sharp geometry as well as cover the top of the head. Now I think I could proceed directly to the next stage, but I think I'm going to blend the transition between base coat and highlight color on the head by glazing. Basically, I'll take my base color, thin it down about 5:1 with water, blot most of it off on my brush, and just lightly feather along the transition. These layers are so thin they dry in seconds, so I can quickly build up successive layers to obscure the transition. After about 10 or so layers, the transition is now a lot softer and I can proceed to the next stage. Using pure light flesh, I pick out the sharpest upward-facing details. Now that skin is looking pretty good. It still needs shading, but that will come later. For now, I've had an idea on how to tie this model back to my Tyranids. I mix orange brown and beige red in equal parts, and apply some dots to the head, increasing in density towards the back of the skull. Now I use German camo black brown and beige red, and do the same, keeping these spots farther back. In so doing, I've replicated the color transition of the Tyranids on the skull of this cultist. Just a subtle touch. Anyways, next I mix orange brown and white in equal parts, and highlight all the raised edges and folds of the skirt. Alright, now I use white gray and use it to highlight the armor plates. I also use it to highlight the upward facing edges of the ribbed armor sections. Next is pale gray blue for the uniform. As with the other areas, just picking out all the raised folds and edges. Now I use pure white and highlight the highest edges of the armor plates and folds in the uniform and skirt. This second highlight stage really adds some pop to the highlights and doesn't take long to apply. For the red, I use heavy red, and just pick out the high edges on the dynamite. I think I could push this a bit further with another highlight layer, but this will be fine for now. Next, cork brown for the edges of the leather. This is a really stark highlight, but I'll be toning it down soon. So here we are with that step completed. Next up is smoke, which is a unique mix of an orange medium and gritty dark brown flecks. I mix this 1:1 with water and carefully apply it as a wash to all the leather and the fuse and cords. You can see this really tones down the highlights on the leather and adds a nice texture. I find smoke really versatile for rust, wood, and leather effects. I'll probably be doing another video on it in the near future. Lastly, the metallics. I use silver to highlight the metal. I really try to keep these highlights to just the upwards facing edges so as to give a strong impression of a downward facing light source. The very last highlight is chrome, selectively applied to the most prominent edges on the metal. Okay, so the model is nicely highlighted, but it lacks shading. Similarly to my Stormtrooper tutorial, I've left the shading step for last, as I can use a wash to shade the model, apply a mild blending effect to the highlights, and dull down the bright colors all in one stage. To facilitate the wash, I give the model a coat of gloss varnish, which will help the wash to avoid pooling. Normally I would wash with black glaze, but since this is an experiment, I'm going to try using Army Painter Dark Tone instead. I apply this to the whole model, wicking off excess as it dries, and the result is what you see here. Well, as you can see, I failed to control pooling in the neck area, and there's a lot of buildup. In the future, if I use dark tone in this manner, I'll probably apply it one section at a time and give it just a little bit of thinning. The last step is to apply matte varnish and base in my usual beach scheme. And here's the finished product. While I'm somewhat disappointed with how the wash turned out, overall I think this was a useful experiment. I think if I were to pursue an army of these, I might eliminate the blue-gray and just use the orange for all the uniform colors to make it a little more prominent. Most of all, I learned through this that the intricate detail of the neophyte sculpts isn't as conducive to speed painting as I'd like, so I probably won't be doing more of these, but I did enjoy the time spent on this one, so it certainly wasn't a waste. Well, that about wraps up this video. If you're interested in the beach basing, I'll put a link to that tutorial in the description. If you have any questions about this or other tutorials, please feel free to leave them below, and I may be doing a video strictly for Q&A in the near future. And as always, thanks for watching.